Hope, there's been some unusual activity on Dad's accounts. You need to see this immediately. Those words from Jennifer Caldwell, our family's financial advisor, changed everything. I'm Hope Smith, 34 years old, and just 5 days earlier, I had buried my father, William Smith, after his sudden battle with pneumonia. I thought losing Dad was the worst pain I'd ever experience. I was devastatingly wrong. What Jennifer showed me on her computer screen that gray Tuesday morning in Maplewood would shatter not just my heart, but my entire understanding of family, trust, and the sister I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. For the past 7 years, while I was building my veterinary practice in downtown Riverside, working 60-hour weeks to establish myself as the go-to animal surgeon in our community, my sister Veronica had been systematically draining our father's accounts, not just taking a few hundred here and there. We're talking about $340,000 over 7 years, money that was supposed to secure Dad's retirement, pay for his medical care, and eventually help both Veronica and me build our futures. But here's what made it even more twisted. Veronica had been playing the role of the devoted daughter the entire time. She moved back home 3 years ago, claiming she wanted to help take care of Dad after Mom passed from breast cancer. She cooked his meals, drove him to doctor appointments, organized his medications, and presented herself as the selfless caregiver, while I was too busy with my career to be around. The truth? Well, I was sending Dad $2,000 every month to help with household expenses and medical bills, money I could barely afford as a new practice owner drowning in student loans. Veronica was transferring thousands directly from his checking and savings accounts into her own personal accounts. She had somehow gained access to his online banking, his investment portfolio, even his retirement fund. Jennifer's hands trembled as she scrolled through 7 years of transaction history. Hope, your father called me 6 months ago with concerns. He said money seemed to be disappearing, but he couldn't understand how. He thought maybe he was forgetting purchases due to his age. Veronica convinced him it was normal confusion and that she'd help him keep better track. My stomach dropped as the pieces fell into place. Every time I visited Dad, Veronica would casually mention how expensive his medications were getting, how the house needed expensive repairs, how his medical bills were piling up. She'd look stressed and overwhelmed, playing the martyr while secretly funneling his life savings into her accounts. The cruelest part, 3 weeks before Dad died, Veronica called me crying, saying Dad's medical expenses were bankrupting him and asking if I could help more financially. Like an idiot, I liquidated my own emergency savings, $15,000, and gave it to her for Dad's care. That money never reached any medical bills. It went straight into the same account where she'd been hoarding Dad's stolen money. But this wasn't just about money. This was about watching my father stress about finances in his final months, watching him apologize to me for being a burden, watching him try to return the groceries I'd buy him because he thought he couldn't afford them. Veronica had stolen his peace of mind along with his financial security. Jennifer pulled up another screen that made my blood run cold. There's more, Hope. 3 days after your father's funeral, Veronica attempted to transfer the remaining $23,000 from his primary account to hers. I blocked the transaction because it required dual authorization as per your father's recent instructions, but she's been calling every day demanding I release the funds. I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath me. My sister, the person who held my hand through Mom's cancer treatments, who helped me study for veterinary school exams, who I trusted to care for our father when I couldn't be there, had been running a calculated, long-term theft operation against our own family. The signs had been there, but I'd been too trusting, too busy, too willing to believe the best about someone I loved. When Veronica bought that new BMW 2 years ago, she said it was financed through her marketing job. When she went on expensive vacations to Costa Rica and Italy, she claimed her company paid for them. When she renovated her apartment with high-end appliances and furniture, she said she'd gotten a promotion and bonus. All lies. All funded by stealing from our aging father who trusted him completely. But here's what Veronica didn't know. What she couldn't have predicted was that our father had been more aware of what was happening than he let on. And in his final weeks, he'd made some decisions that would expose everything she'd done and ensure justice would finally be served. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was betraying you behind your back, if you've ever had a family member steal not just your money, but your peace of mind, drop a comment below. Because what I'm about to tell you is how I uncovered the full scope of Veronica's deception, how I fought back against someone who thought she could manipulate grief and family loyalty to cover her crimes, and how sometimes the people who hurt us the most also underestimate us the most. This is the story of how I uncovered 7 years of theft, saved what was left of my father's legacy, and learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. And it's proof that even when you're drowning in grief and disbelief, the truth has a way of surfacing, and justice has a way of finding those who think they're too clever to get caught. Let me tell you who I am and why this betrayal cut so deep that it nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for.
I'm Hope Smith, and I've been fighting for everything I have since I was 18 years old. Growing up in Maplewood, I was the kid who brought home injured birds and convinced my parents to let me nurse them back to health in our garage. While other teenagers were at parties, I was volunteering at the Riverside Animal Shelter, cleaning kennels and learning everything I could about animal care. My father, William Smith, worked double shifts at the Maplewood steel plant for 32 years to support our family. My mother, Patricia, was a school nurse who spent her evenings tutoring kids from low-income families for free. We weren't wealthy, but we were rich in values, honesty, hard work, and taking care of each other no matter what. When I told my parents I wanted to become a veterinarian, Dad didn't hesitate for a second. "Hopi," he said, using the nickname he'd called me since I was 5, "if that's your dream, we'll find a way to make it happen." He took on weekend construction jobs, Mom worked extra shifts, and together they helped me get through undergraduate school at Riverside University. Veronica, my sister, is 2 years younger than me. Growing up, we were inseparable. She was the artistic one, painting, photography, creative writing, while I was the science nerd, dissecting owl pellets and reading veterinary journals. She always said she admired my dedication, how I never gave up on anything I cared about. "You're gonna change the world, Hope," she'd tell me when I'd stress about organic chemistry or worry about vet school applications. When I got accepted to the Westfield Veterinary College, it was a family celebration. Dad barbecued steaks, a rare treat in our household, and Mom cried happy tears. Veronica made a photo album of all the animals I'd helped over the years with a note that said, "To my sister, who proves that dreams really do come true when you work hard enough." Veterinary school was brutal. 4 years of 18-hour days, mountains of debt, and constant pressure. But my family was my anchor. Dad would call every Sunday, not to ask about my grades, but to tell me how proud he was, just watching me chase my dreams. Mom would send care packages with homemade cookies and handwritten notes of encouragement. And Veronica, she visited me every few months, always bringing stories about home and reminding me that I had people rooting for me. When Mom was diagnosed with breast cancer during my 3rd year of vet school, everything changed. I wanted to drop out, come home, help with her care. But Mom wouldn't hear of it. "Hope, you're so close to finishing. I'm not letting cancer rob you of your dreams too." Veronica stepped up in ways that amazed me. She moved back home, took a remote marketing job, and became Mom's primary caregiver while I finished school. Those 8 months of Mom's treatment were the hardest our family had ever faced. But Veronica was incredible. She drove Mom to every chemotherapy appointment, learned to cook all of Mom's favorite foods when she was too weak to eat, and somehow managed to keep Mom's spirits up even on the darkest days. When I'd call home stressed about exams, worried I should be there instead of in school, Veronica would reassure me. Mom and I have this handled. You focus on becoming the veterinarian she's so proud of. Mom passed away 2 weeks before my veterinary school graduation. I was devastated, but Veronica organized everything: the funeral, the reception, even made sure I had a black dress that fit properly. At the graduation ceremony, Dad and Veronica sat in the front row, holding Mom's photo. When they called my name, I could see Dad wiping away tears of pride mixed with grief. After graduation, I faced a choice that would define everything. I had job offers from established veterinary practices in big cities, safer options with guaranteed salaries. But I also had an opportunity to buy into a small practice in downtown Riverside, 30 minutes from Maplewood. It was risky, expensive, and would mean starting at the bottom again. But it would also mean staying close to Dad, especially as he grieved Mom's loss. Veronica encouraged me to take the risk. She said, "Dad needs family nearby. And besides, you've always wanted to build something of your own. This is your chance." So I took out additional loans, maxed out my credit cards, and bought a partnership in Riverside Veterinary Associates. The first 3 years were incredibly hard. I was working 60-hour weeks, taking emergency calls at all hours, and barely making enough to cover my student loans and living expenses. But I was building something meaningful, a practice known for compassionate care and advanced surgical techniques. My reputation grew steadily, and pet owners started specifically requesting me for complex procedures. During those tough early years, Dad was my biggest supporter. He'd stop by the clinic with homemade sandwiches when I worked late, and he'd tell everyone in Maplewood about my daughter, the surgeon who saves animals' lives. When I finally started earning decent money, my first priority was helping Dad. I knew his pension from the steel plant wasn't much, especially with rising healthcare costs. That's when I started sending Dad $2,000 a month. It wasn't easy. It meant living in a tiny apartment, driving a 15-year-old Honda, and buying generic groceries. But seeing Dad's relief when he could afford his medications without stress, watching him fix up the house Mom had loved so much, knowing he could go to his doctor's appointments without worrying about copays, that made every sacrifice worth it.
Veronica seemed to understand this better than anyone. She'd often tell me how grateful Dad was for my help, how much it meant to him to see me succeeding. "He brags about you constantly," she'd say. "How you work so hard, how you never forget family, even when you're building your career." What I didn't know was that while I was sacrificing to help Dad maintain his dignity and independence, while I was working myself to exhaustion to send him money every month, Veronica was stealing from him systematically. The sister who had held our family together during Mom's cancer, who had encouraged my dreams and celebrated my successes, who I trusted completely with Dad's well-being, was running a carefully planned theft operation that would rob him of his security and peace of mind. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone in the world was someone I didn't know at all. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm by the time Dad turned 72. After Mom's death 5 years earlier, we'd all found our new normal, and frankly, it felt like our family was stronger than ever. Every Sunday, I'd drive from my apartment in Riverside to Dad's house in Maplewood for what we called family dinner. It was a tradition that started when Veronica moved back home permanently 3 years ago. She'd always have something delicious cooking, Dad's favorite pot roast or the lasagna recipe Mom used to make, complete with the secret ingredient of a dash of cinnamon that made all the difference. These Sunday dinners were sacred to us. Dad would sit at the head of our old oak dining table, the same one where we'd done homework as kids, and he'd want to hear everything about our weeks. I'd tell him about the complicated surgeries I'd performed, the new equipment I was saving up to buy for the clinic, the continuing education courses I was taking to stay current with veterinary innovations. Veronica would share stories about her remote marketing work for Pemberton Digital Solutions, a company based out of Chicago that specialized in social media campaigns for small businesses. She'd gotten the job 2 years after Mom's death, and it seemed perfect for her creative skills. She could work from anywhere, set her own schedule, and most importantly, be available whenever Dad needed her. I landed 3 new clients this week, she'd announced proudly, showing us the websites and social media campaigns she'd designed. One's a bakery in Portland, another's a vintage clothing store in Austin, and there's this amazing little bookstore in Seattle that wants to expand their online presence. Dad would beam with pride, asking detailed questions about her work, genuinely fascinated by how she could help businesses grow through creativity and technology. The division of responsibilities between Veronica and me felt natural and fair. I was the financial contributor. Beyond my monthly $2,000 to Dad, I also covered any unexpected expenses that came up. When the furnace needed replacing 2 winters ago, I handled the $4,200 bill. When Dad's prescription costs spiked because Medicare didn't fully cover his new heart medication, I set up an additional monthly transfer to cover the difference. Veronica was the hands-on caregiver and companion. She grocery shopped with Dad every Tuesday, turning it into a social outing they both enjoyed. She organized his medications in weekly pill containers, a system that gave him independence while ensuring he never missed a dose. She drove him to all his medical appointments, keeping detailed notes about what the doctor said and following up on any recommendations. More than that, Veronica provided the daily companionship Dad needed. They'd watch old movies together on Friday nights. Dad loved John Wayne westerns, and Veronica would indulge him, even though she preferred romantic comedies. She taught him how to video chat on his tablet so he could see his grandkids when my cousin Rachel visited from Denver. When Dad decided he wanted to learn how to use a smartphone, Veronica spent hours patiently teaching him, celebrating every small victory like he was a child learning to read. Their relationship had always been special, but it deepened after Mom's death in ways that warmed my heart. Dad had worried about becoming a burden, about being lonely, about losing his independence. Veronica's presence solved all those concerns. She was his companion without making him feel dependent, his helper without making him feel helpless. "I don't know what I'd do without Ronnie," Dad would tell me regularly, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "She makes everything easier, but she never makes me feel like I can't handle things myself." It was exactly what Dad needed and exactly what Veronica seemed born to provide. The financial arrangement we'd worked out felt sustainable and appropriate. My monthly contributions covered Dad's basic expenses: utilities, groceries, medications, and a little extra for entertainment and unexpected costs. This allowed him to keep his pension and Social Security for his own discretionary spending and to maintain the savings account he'd built over decades of careful budgeting. Dad had always been modest about his finances, but I knew he wasn't struggling. He'd mentioned small purchases that brought him joy: a new biography of Theodore Roosevelt, a bird feeder for the backyard, tickets to take Veronica to dinner at Romano's, their favorite Italian restaurant. He seemed comfortable, secure, and most importantly, dignified in his ability to cover his own wants while accepting help with his needs. Veronica never asked me for money directly, which I respected. When Dad had unexpected expenses, he'd call me himself, apologetic but grateful. "Hopi, the water heater is making strange noises, and the repair guy says it needs to be replaced. I hate to ask, but could you help me out?" Of course I'd help. That's what family was for. But I appreciated that these requests came from Dad himself, not filtered through Veronica, which maintained his sense of autonomy.
Our system worked because it was built on trust, communication, and clearly defined roles. I focused on building my veterinary practice, knowing Dad was in excellent hands. Veronica focused on Dad's daily care and companionship, knowing that financial pressures weren't something he had to worry about. Dad got to age gracefully in his own home, surrounded by love, with his dignity intact. The 3 of us had even started planning for the future together.
Dad was adamant about staying in that family home as long as possible, and we'd researched modifications that might be needed as he aged. Grab bars in the bathroom, a stair lift if his knees got worse, maybe converting the downstairs den into a bedroom if stairs became too difficult. We'd also had the important conversations about his wishes if his health declined significantly. Dad had clear preferences about end-of-life care, and both Veronica and I understood his values. He wanted to avoid aggressive interventions that would prolong suffering without improving quality of life. He wanted to die at home, if possible. He wanted us to celebrate his life rather than mourn his death when the time came. These weren't easy conversations, but having them openly gave all of us peace of mind. Dad knew his wishes would be respected. Veronica and I knew we wouldn't have to guess what he would want during a crisis. Everything felt planned, secure, and built on the foundation of mutual love and respect that had always defined our family. Dad seemed genuinely happy during this period of his life. Yes, he missed Mom terribly, we all did, but he'd found ways to honor her memory while building a fulfilling routine. He volunteered at the Maplewood Community Center, teaching basic computer skills to other seniors. He joined a book club at the local library. He took daily walks around the neighborhood, stopping to chat with neighbors who'd known our family for decades. "Your mother would be so proud of how we're all taking care of each other," he'd say sometimes, usually during our Sunday dinners when the conversation turned reflective. "Hope you're building something beautiful with your practice, helping animals and their families. Ronnie, you're using your talents to help small businesses thrive. And you're both making sure I'm not lonely or struggling. This is what family should be." It was what family should be. We were living proof that love, communication, and shared responsibility could create a support system that honored everyone's needs and dignity. Dad felt cared for without feeling dependent. I felt useful and connected despite my demanding career. Veronica felt valued for her caregiving abilities and creative skills. None of us could have imagined that this beautiful, functional family dynamic was built on a foundation of lies and theft. That while Dad was expressing gratitude for our family's love and support, one of us was systematically stealing his security and independence. That while I was working extra hours and making financial sacrifices to ensure Dad's comfort, those very sacrifices were enabling someone else's deception. The normal world we'd built was about to shatter completely, and none of us saw it coming. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was already awake, performing emergency surgery on a golden retriever who'd been hit by a car, when my phone buzzed insistently on the surgery room counter. Normally, I'd never answer during a procedure, but something about the timing made my stomach clench with dread. "Dr. Smith, you need to get to Maplewood General immediately." Veronica's voice was shaking, barely coherent through her tears. "It's Dad. He collapsed at home. They think it might be his heart, but he's also burning up with fever. The paramedics are working on him now, but Hope, it doesn't look good." I'd never driven faster in my life. The 30-minute trip to Maplewood General took me 18 minutes, and I barely remember the drive. All I could think about was Dad's voice from our last phone call 3 days earlier. He seemed tired, mentioned feeling a bit under the weather, but he insisted it was just a minor cold. "Don't worry about your old man, Hopi. Ronnie's got me drinking enough tea to float a battleship, and you know her chicken soup could cure anything." When I burst through the emergency room doors, Veronica was pacing in the waiting area, her face streaked with tears, still wearing the paint-splattered pajamas she'd obviously thrown on in a hurry. She fell into my arms the moment she saw me, and for several minutes we just held each other, both terrified of losing the only parent we had left. "Tell me everything," I said when we finally sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed to make waiting even more unbearable. "I heard a crash around 2:30, Veronica said, her voice still shaky. "It woke me up and I thought maybe he'd gotten up for water and knocked something over, but when I called out to him, he didn't answer. I found him on the bathroom floor, unconscious, burning up with fever. Hope, he was so hot I could feel the heat radiating from him before I even touched him." The next 6 hours were a blur of medical jargon, worried conferences between doctors, and the horrible helplessness that comes with watching someone you love fight for their life while you can do nothing but wait. Dad had developed what the doctors called a perfect storm of health crises. A severe respiratory infection triggered pneumonia, which put additional strain on his already weakened heart, leading to what they classified as a cardiac event. Not quite a full heart attack, but serious enough to require intensive monitoring.
Dr. Ramirez, the attending physician, was gentle but direct when she spoke with us. Your father is stable for now, but he's critically ill. The pneumonia is aggressive, and his heart is struggling to cope with the additional stress. The next 48 to 72 hours will be crucial. Those 3 days blurred together into an endless cycle of hospital vigils, medical updates, and desperate hope. Veronica and I took shifts staying with Dad, making sure someone was always there when he was awake. During his lucid moments, he seemed more worried about us than about himself. "You girls shouldn't be missing work because of me," he'd whisper, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd had to insert temporarily. "I'm tougher than I look. This old body has survived worse." But we could see how much the illness was taking out of him. Dad had always been the kind of man who bounced back quickly from minor health issues. This time was different. The pneumonia was relentless, and even with aggressive antibiotic treatment, his recovery was slower than anyone hoped. On Thursday evening, Dad seemed to rally. His fever broke for the first time in days, and he was sitting up in bed joking with the nurses about the hospital food. "Hope, you should see what they're calling meatloaf," he said with a weak smile. "I think your mother's dog would have turned his nose up at this." That night, for the first time since Tuesday, both Veronica and I went home to shower, change clothes, and get a few hours of real sleep. "He's turning the corner," Dr. Ramirez had told us. "The worst seems to be behind him." We were wrong. I got the call at 5:23 a.m. on Friday. Dad had taken a sudden turn during the night. His fever had spiked again, higher than before, and his heart rhythm had become dangerously irregular. By the time Veronica and I made it back to the hospital, Dad was unconscious again, surrounded by machines and medical staff working with quiet urgency. Dr. Ramirez pulled us aside, and I could see in her eyes that the news wasn't good. The infection has become septic. His body is struggling to fight it off, and the stress is more than his heart can handle. We're doing everything we can, but you should prepare yourselves. The next few hours are critical. Those were the longest hours of my life. Veronica and I sat on either side of Dad's bed, holding his hands, talking to him even though he couldn't respond. We told him stories about Mom, shared memories from our childhood, assured him over and over that we loved him and that it was okay if he needed to rest. Dad passed away quietly at 11:42 p.m. on Friday, October 15th. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words. He simply stopped breathing while Veronica and I were holding his hands, and the machines that had been keeping track of his vital signs began their final, monotonous alarms. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, but in those first moments after Dad died, I felt grateful that we'd been there with him, that he hadn't died alone, that we'd had the chance to tell him we loved him even if he couldn't respond. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my grief-stricken state, was that Dad's death had created an opportunity that Veronica had been waiting for. While I was making funeral arrangements and notifying relatives, while I was drowning in the logistics of death and the emotional weight of losing our last parent, Veronica was already planning her next moves. The funeral was beautiful and heartbreaking. Dad had been well-loved in Maplewood, and the church was packed with neighbors, former co-workers, and friends who'd known our family for decades. Veronica delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about Dad's kindness, his work ethic, and his devotion to family. She spoke about how proud he was of both his daughters, how much he'd loved watching us build our adult lives, and how his greatest joy had been knowing that Veronica and I would always take care of each other. Dad used to say that the best thing he and Mom ever did was raise two daughters who loved each other as much as they loved their parents. He knew that no matter what happened, Hope and I would be there for each other, just like we were there for him.
I was so proud of her in that moment, so grateful to have her as my sister, so comforted by the knowledge that we'd face the future together, just as we'd face Dad's illness together. After the funeral, friends and neighbors filled Dad's house, sharing stories and comfort food, celebrating Dad's life in the way he would have wanted. Veronica moved through the crowd gracefully, thanking people for coming, accepting condolences, making sure everyone felt welcome. She seemed to be handling everything with remarkable strength, and I was grateful that I didn't have to shoulder all the hosting responsibilities alone. It wasn't until 3 days later, when the house was quiet again, and the reality of Dad's absence was beginning to sink in, that I started thinking about practical matters. Dad's affairs needed to be settled, his accounts needed to be reviewed, and we needed to figure out what to do with the house, his belongings, and his remaining finances. That's when I called Jennifer Caldwell, our family's financial advisor, to schedule a meeting. We need to review Dad's accounts and figure out what needs to be done. Veronica and I want to make sure everything is handled properly.
I expected a routine meeting about closing accounts, transferring assets, and dealing with the paperwork that comes with settling an estate. I thought it would be sad but straightforward, a final act of love and responsibility toward the father who had given us everything. I had no idea that Jennifer was about to reveal something that would destroy not just my understanding of our family's finances, but my trust in the sister I'd loved and relied on my entire life. Dad's death hadn't just taken away our last parent, it had also removed the only thing standing between Veronica and the completion of a plan that had been years in the making. The morning after my meeting with Jennifer Caldwell, I sat in my car outside Dad's house for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside. My hands were still shaking from what I'd learned about the missing $340,000, and I needed to confront Veronica. But more than that, I needed to understand how this was possible. There had to be an explanation, some misunderstanding that Jennifer and I had missed. I found Veronica in Dad's kitchen, methodically packing dishes into cardboard boxes. She looked up when I walked in, and her smile seemed forced, strained in a way I'd never noticed before. "Hope, I didn't expect you so early. I thought I'd get a head start on organizing Dad's things. We should probably donate most of the kitchen stuff. Neither of us really needs 2 sets of everything, right?" She was talking too fast, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Veronica, we need to talk." I set my purse down on the counter with more force than necessary. I met with Jennifer yesterday about Dad's accounts. The change in her expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The forced smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Oh, good. I was hoping we could get all that financial stuff sorted out quickly. I know Dad would want us to handle everything efficiently." "There are some serious discrepancies in his accounts," I said, watching her face carefully. "Money that should be there isn't. Jennifer thinks there might have been unauthorized transfers." Veronica set down the stack of plates she'd been holding and turned to face me fully. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Dad was getting pretty forgetful toward the end, Hope. You know how he'd sometimes pay bills twice or forget he'd already bought something. Maybe he moved money around and didn't remember." The casual way she dismissed it, the speed with which she offered an explanation that painted Dad as confused and incompetent, made my stomach clench. "Veronica, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. This isn't about forgetting to balance a checkbook." For a moment, something flickered across her face. Anger, maybe, or calculation. But then she stepped forward and took my hands in hers, her expression shifting to one of concerned sympathy. "Hope, I know you're stressed. We both are. Losing Dad, dealing with all this estate stuff, it's overwhelming. But you're looking for problems that aren't there. Dad trusted me to help him with his finances because he knew I was good with numbers and computer stuff. Sometimes I'd have to move money between accounts to get better interest rates or pay bills more efficiently. Jennifer probably just doesn't understand Dad's system." The way she said Dad's system, as if she'd been some kind of authorized financial manager rather than a daughter who should have had no access to his accounts, sent a chill down my spine.
but her voice was so reasonable, so concerned for my emotional state, that I almost wanted to believe her. "Why don't I come with you to meet with Jennifer?" Veronica continued, her grip on my hands tightening slightly. "I can explain Dad's financial arrangements, show her the records I helped him keep. I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." That afternoon, the three of us sat in Jennifer's office while Veronica spun an elaborate story about Dad's financial strategy. According to her version, Dad had become worried about bank security after reading about identity theft and had asked him to help him move money between different accounts and financial institutions to diversify his risk. Dad was really anxious about keeping all his money in one place, Veronica explained, pulling out a folder of printed bank statements. He'd read these articles about banks failing or accounts being hacked, and he wanted me to help him spread his assets around. Some months I'd move money to higher yield savings accounts, other months I'd shift things back to checking for easier access. She had documents, bank statements, printouts of transfers, even handwritten notes that looked like Dad's writing. It was impressive and detailed, and if I hadn't known what Jennifer had already discovered, I might have been convinced. But Jennifer wasn't buying it. "Miss Smith," she said carefully, "these transfers you're describing as moving money between your father's accounts actually show funds going into accounts with your names on them. Can you explain that?" Veronica didn't miss a beat. "Oh, those are joint accounts that Dad and I set up together. He wanted me to have access in case of emergencies, and he thought it would be easier to manage his money if we consolidated some of his assets into accounts we could both monitor." She leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of patient explanation. "Dad was really worried about what would happen if he had a medical emergency and couldn't access his funds. This way, I could pay his bills and handle his expenses without having to go through a lengthy legal process." It sounded reasonable. It sounded caring. It sounded exactly like something our responsible, forward-thinking father might have arranged. But something about the way Veronica presented it felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing this explanation for a long time.
Jennifer pressed further. "I don't see any documentation of your father authorizing these joint accounts. Typically, we'd have paperwork showing his explicit consent for this kind of arrangement." "Dad handled most of that stuff directly with the banks," Veronica replied smoothly. "You know how he was. He liked to do things in person rather than going through intermediaries. He probably didn't think to copy you on the paperwork, since it was more about convenience than investment strategy." Over the following days, Veronica's behavior became increasingly strange, though she tried to hide it behind a veneer of helpful organization. She seemed to be in a constant hurry to get Dad's affairs settled, pushing me to make quick decisions about his belongings, his house, and his remaining accounts. "We should probably sell the house as soon as possible," she said one morning while we were going through Dad's closets. "The real estate market is good right now, and it doesn't make sense to let it sit empty while we figure out what to do with it." When I suggested we might want to take our time, maybe keep the house in case one of us ever wanted to move back to Maplewood, Veronica became unusually insistent. "Hope, you're being sentimental. Dad wouldn't want us to burden ourselves with an empty house when we could use the money to pay off your student loans or invest in your practice." She had answers for everything, solutions that always seemed to involve quickly liquidating Dad's assets and moving money around. When I mentioned wanting to review Dad's financial records more carefully, she offered to organize everything for me. When I said I thought we should get a second opinion about the missing money, she suggested I was overthinking things and looking for problems that don't exist. Most disturbing was how she began to subtly undermine my relationship with Jennifer and other people who might ask questions about Dad's finances. "Jennifer seems really confused about Dad's accounts," she'd say. "I wonder if she's getting too old to keep track of all her clients properly." Or, "Hope, you've been under so much stress with the practice and now losing Dad. Maybe you're not seeing things clearly right now." She started making unilateral decisions about Dad's affairs, presenting them to me as necessary steps that couldn't wait for lengthy discussions.
She scheduled an estate sale for Dad's furniture and belongings, arranged for our real estate agent to evaluate the house, and even contacted Dad's bank about closing his remaining accounts, all without consulting me first. "I'm just trying to handle the details so you don't have to worry about them," she'd explain when I questioned her actions. "You have your practice to run, and I know how hard this whole situation is for you emotionally. Let me take care of the practical stuff." But her version of taking care of the practical stuff seemed designed to prevent anyone from looking too closely at what really happened to Dad's money. Every step she took moved us further away from transparency and closer to a point where questions would become impossible to answer. The most chilling moment came when I suggested we should probably consult with an estate attorney to make sure we were handling everything properly. Veronica's response was swift and decisive. "That's really not necessary, Hope. Dad's estate is pretty straightforward, and lawyers just complicate things and eat up money with unnecessary fees. Besides, since I was helping Dad manage his finances toward the end, I already understand how everything is set up. Trust me, I can guide us through this process without spending thousands of dollars on legal fees for something we can handle ourselves." The way she said, "trust me," felt like a threat wrapped in a request. And for the first time since Dad's death, I realized that maybe I shouldn't be trusting her at all. Maybe I shouldn't have been trusting her for years. But confronting that possibility meant accepting that everything I believed about my sister, about our family, about the last 3 years of Dad's life had been built on lies. And I wasn't ready to face that devastating truth yet. Something was wrong. Every instinct I'd developed as a veterinarian, the ability to read subtle signs, to notice when symptoms didn't add up, and trust my gut when something felt off, was screaming at me that Veronica's explanations didn't make sense. But she was my sister, the person I trusted most in the world for 34 years. Going against that trust felt like betraying not just her, but everything I believed about family and loyalty. I decided to start small, to look for inconsistencies without making accusations. That weekend, while Veronica was at Romano's restaurant sorting through Dad's papers with the estate sale coordinator, I went to Dad's house alone. I told myself I was just looking for photo albums and personal mementos, but really, I was searching for evidence that might support or contradict Veronica's version of events. Dad had always been meticulous about record keeping. In his home office, I found file folders labeled by year, containing bank statements, tax documents, and receipts, organized with the precision of someone who'd grown up during the Depression and never forgot the importance of tracking every penny. As I went through the files, I started noticing discrepancies that made my chest tighten with dread.
The bank statements from 3 years ago showed consistent balances that made sense with Dad's pension and Social Security income, minus reasonable living expenses. But starting about 2.5 years ago, there were regular transfers out of his accounts that weren't matched by any receipts or explanations in his meticulous filing system. Dad always kept receipts for everything. Groceries, medications, utility bills, even the $3.50 he spent on his weekly newspaper. But these transfers, sometimes for $5,000 or $8,000 at a time, had no corresponding documentation. I photographed the statements with my phone, my hands shaking as I realized the pattern. The transfers were always on different days of the month, never the same amount twice, but they were consistent. Every month, sometimes twice a month, money was leaving Dad's accounts with no paper trail to explain where it was going. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. In a folder marked Important Documents, there was a handwritten note in Dad's careful script dated just 4 months before his death. Asked Jennifer to change online passwords. Too many transactions I don't remember making. Need to keep better track. Dad had been aware that something was wrong. He'd been concerned enough to change his banking passwords and ask Jennifer for help monitoring his accounts. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd willingly set up joint accounts and authorize regular transfers. This was someone who suspected he was being robbed. I needed to understand how Veronica had gained access to Dad's accounts in the first place. That Monday morning, instead of going to my clinic, I drove to First National Bank of Maplewood, where Dad had done his banking for over 30 years.
I asked to speak with Patricia Henley, the branch manager who'd known our family since I was in high school. Hope, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was such a gentleman. He'd always ask about your veterinary practice whenever he came in. Thank you, Patricia. I'm here because I'm trying to understand Dad's banking arrangements from the last few years. My sister says she was helping him manage his accounts, but I'm finding some inconsistencies. Patricia's expression became carefully neutral, the look bank employees get when they're about to navigate sensitive territory. I can't discuss specific account details without proper authorization, but I can tell you that your father did express some concerns about his accounts in recent months. What kind of concerns? He came in several times asking about transactions he didn't remember authorizing. We walked through his statements together, and he seemed genuinely confused about some of the activity. When we suggested he might want to change his online banking passwords and consider sending up account alerts, he was very receptive to those security measures. My suspicions were being confirmed, but I needed more concrete evidence. Patricia explained that without being named on Dad's accounts, she couldn't show me transaction details, but she suggested I might want to contact the bank's fraud investigation department if I suspected unauthorized activity. That afternoon, I called Jennifer and asked her to meet with me privately, without Veronica. I need to understand something. I told her, when you discovered the missing money, did you see any evidence that Dad had actually authorized those joint accounts Veronica mentioned? Jennifer was quiet for a long moment before responding. Hope, I've been your family's financial advisor for 12 years. Your father never mentioned setting up joint accounts with Veronica. In fact, the last time we spoke, about 6 months before he passed, he specifically asked me about ways to better monitor his banking accounts because he was concerned about unauthorized transactions. Did he suspect Veronica specifically? He didn't name anyone, but he did mention that someone close to him had access to his computer and might have seen him enter his banking passwords. He was worried, but didn't want to make accusations without proof. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture I didn't want to see. Dad had been aware that money was disappearing. He'd tried to protect himself by changing passwords and seeking help, but he'd been too trusting, too unwilling to believe that someone in his family could be stealing from him to take more decisive action. I decided I needed to see the actual bank records that Veronica had shown us in Jennifer's office. I asked Jennifer if she could request detailed transaction histories from the banks where the questionable accounts were held. As a financial advisor with proper authorization, she could access information that I couldn't get as an individual. While waiting for those records, I started paying closer attention to Veronica's behavior and statements. I began keeping a notebook, writing down things she said that didn't quite add up, inconsistencies in her explanations, and moments when her reactions seemed inappropriate or calculated. One evening, while we were having dinner at a restaurant near Dad's house, Veronica mentioned casually that she'd found some old bank statements in Dad's desk that she thought we should throw away. They're like 5 years old, just cluttering up space, and we'll never need them for anything. But I'd already been through Dad's desk thoroughly. There were no old bank statements there. Dad kept all his financial records in the filing cabinet in his office, organized by year. Either Veronica was lying about finding them, or she'd moved them there from somewhere else. Either way, it suggested she was actively trying to control what financial information I might see. I started asking more pointed questions, pretending to be curious rather than suspicious. Veronica, when exactly did Dad ask you to help him with his finances? I'm trying to remember when that conversation happened.
Her answer changed slightly each time I asked. Sometimes it was 2 years ago, sometimes 3. Sometimes Dad had asked for her help. Sometimes she'd offered when she noticed he was struggling. The details were always different, but she told each version with such confidence that it was clear she'd been refining the story for a long time. The breakthrough came when I decided to check something Veronica probably didn't think I'd notice. She'd mentioned that Dad had been worried about bank security and wanted to diversify his assets. But Dad was a creature of habit who'd used the same bank for 3 decades and had always been skeptical of financial complexity. It didn't match his personality to suddenly become interested in sophisticated asset management. I drove to Riverside Community Bank, where Veronica claimed Dad had opened one of his diversified accounts.
I'd never heard him mention banking anywhere except First National. When I asked the customer service representative if my father had ever had an account there, they checked their records and confirmed what I'd already suspected. William Smith had never been a customer at their bank. But when I gave them Veronica's full name, Veronica Marie Smith, their records showed she'd been a customer for over 2 years, with significant deposits that matched the time frame of the missing money from Dad's accounts. The evidence was mounting, but I still needed proof that would be convincing enough to take legal action. Veronica had been careful to create plausible explanations for everything, and I knew that confronting her without absolute proof would just give her time to destroy evidence or create more elaborate lies. I also realized that I needed help. This wasn't something I could investigate alone, and I certainly couldn't resolve it just between Veronica and me. She'd already shown how skilled she was at manipulation and how prepared she was with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. That night, I called my cousin Michael, who worked as a police detective in the neighboring county. Without giving him details, I asked him what someone should do if they suspected a family member of financial fraud. He recommended contacting both the police and a forensic accountant who specialized in financial crimes. "Hope," he said, "if you're asking this question, you probably already know the answer. When family members steal from each other, it's rarely a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. It's usually deliberate, planned, and extensive. And the longer you wait to address it, the harder it becomes to recover what was stolen." As I hung up the phone, I realized I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd been trying to give Veronica the benefit of the doubt, looking for innocent explanations, hoping to find evidence that would prove her innocence rather than her guilt. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my loyalty to my sister was preventing me from protecting Dad's memory and ensuring justice for what had been done to him. It was time to stop investigating and start acting, but I also knew that once I took the next step, there would be no going back. I would be choosing truth over family loyalty, justice over keeping the peace. I would be accepting that the sister I'd loved and trusted my entire life was a thief who'd spent years stealing from our vulnerable father. And I would be doing it alone, because the one person who should have been fighting this battle alongside me was the person I was fighting against. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. Armed with the evidence I'd gathered, Dad's handwritten note about unauthorized transactions, the bank confirmation that he'd never opened accounts where Veronica claimed he had, and the pattern of transfers that matched deposits into her personal accounts. I knew I had to confront her directly, but I wanted to do it in front of a witness, someone who could verify what was said and prevent Veronica from later claiming I'd misunderstood or misrepresented our conversation. I arranged to meet with both Veronica and Jennifer at the financial advisor's office on a Thursday morning. I told Veronica we needed to finalize Dad's estate paperwork, that Jennifer had some additional questions that required both of us to be present. I could hear the slight tension in Veronica's voice when she agreed to the meeting, but she maintained her helpful, cooperative tone. "Of course, Hope, whatever Jennifer needs to get this resolved. I know Dad would want us to handle everything properly." That morning, I arrived at Jennifer's office early, my stomach churning with anxiety and dread. Jennifer could see how stressed I was and offered me coffee, but I was too nervous to drink anything. My hands were shaking as I organized the documents I'd found: Dad's handwritten note, printouts of bank statements, photos of the discrepancies I'd discovered. When Veronica arrived, she was perfectly put together as always, hair-styled, makeup flawless, wearing the navy blue blazer that made her look professional and trustworthy. She greeted Jennifer warmly and turned to me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Hope, you look exhausted. Are you sleeping okay? I know all this estate stuff is overwhelming, but we're almost through it." Jennifer began the meeting by explaining that she'd received additional information about Dad's accounts that raised serious questions. She pulled out a thick folder of bank records that had arrived from her investigation requests. Veronica's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She leaned forward to examine the papers, her brow furrowed in apparent confusion. "I don't understand what you're seeing here, Jennifer. These look like the same records we discussed before. Dad's system of moving money between accounts for better security and interest rates." "Veronica," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected, "these accounts aren't Dad's accounts. They're your personal accounts. Dad never authorized joint accounts. I found his note saying he was concerned about unauthorized transactions, and the bank confirmed he never opened accounts at the institutions where this money was transferred. For just a moment, Veronica's mask slipped. I saw something flicker across her face. Anger, calculation, maybe panic. But then she recovered, and her expression shifted to one of hurt confusion. Hope, what are you implying? Are you seriously suggesting that I stole from Dad? Her voice broke slightly, as if she were fighting back tears. How can you even think that about me after everything I did for him? All the sacrifices I made to take care of him? I'm not implying anything, I said, pulling out Dad's handwritten note. This is Dad's handwriting, dated 4 months before he died. He wrote that he asked Jennifer to change his passwords because there were too many transactions he didn't remember making. Jennifer nodded, adding her professional weight to my accusations. Mr. Smith contacted me several times in his final months with concerns about his accounts. He specifically asked for help monitoring his transactions because he suspected unauthorized activity. That's when Veronica's strategy shifted, and I saw a side of my sister I'd never witnessed before. The hurt confusion vanished, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled rage. You know what, Hope? You're right. I did take Dad's money. But it wasn't stealing, it was saving our family from your selfishness. Her voice was sharp now, all pretense of grief and cooperation gone. Do you have any idea what it was like watching Dad struggle while you sent your pathetic $2,000 a month and called it helping? I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. What are you talking about? Dad's medical bills were astronomical. His medications cost more than his entire pension some months. The house was falling apart, the furnace barely worked, the roof leaked every time it rained hard. But you were too busy playing successful veterinarian in your fancy practice to notice that your monthly pittance wasn't covering anything close to his actual needs. Jennifer and I stared at her in shock as she continued, her voice rising with each word. I was the one holding everything together. I was the one making sure he had food in his refrigerator, heat in the winter, a roof that didn't leak. I was the one sitting in hospital waiting rooms, dealing with insurance companies, managing his medications. And what were you doing? Working 70 hours a week and patting yourself on the back for sending money you could barely afford. So you decided to steal his life savings instead of talking to me, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I decided to use Dad's money for Dad's care instead of letting it sit in accounts earning nothing while he suffered. She was standing now, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. Every dollar I took went to his expenses, his real expenses, not the sanitized version you got to see on your Sunday visits. Veronica, there are records showing this money went into your personal accounts. Money you used for your car payments, your vacation to Costa Rica, your apartment renovation. Veronica whirled around to face Jennifer, her face flushed with anger. You don't know anything about what I sacrificed. I gave up 3 years of my life to take care of him. I turned down job opportunities. I couldn't travel. I couldn't have a social life because I was constantly worried about Dad. Do you think I didn't deserve some compensation for that sacrifice? The words hit me like physical blows. She wasn't even denying it anymore. She was justifying it, reframing theft as deserved payment for caregiving. You were compensated, I said, finding my voice again. You lived in his house rent-free. I covered all his major expenses. You had a remote job that gave you flexibility, and more than that, you claimed you wanted to take care of him. You said it was your choice, your way of giving back to Dad. My choice? Veronica laughed, but there was no humor in it. What choice did I have? You were building your precious career too important to be bothered with the day-to-day reality of caring for an aging parent. Someone had to do it, and as usual, it fell to me to clean up what you were too selfish to handle properly. I felt tears starting to form, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and betrayal so complete that I could barely breathe. Dad trusted you, I said. He bragged about you to everyone. He said you were the best daughter a father could ask for. And while he was telling people how grateful he was for your care, you were stealing his security, his peace of mind, his dignity.
Dad died comfortable and cared for. That's more than would have happened if we'd relied on your long-distance guilt payments. Jennifer had been taking notes throughout this exchange, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. Mrs. Smith, she said to Veronica, what you're describing constitutes financial elder abuse. These weren't authorized transfers or legitimate caregiving expenses. This was systematic theft from a vulnerable adult. Call it whatever you want, Veronica said, finally sitting back down but maintaining her defiant posture. I did what needed to be done.
Dad got the care he needed, and I got compensated for 3 years of my life that I'll never get back. As I sat there listening to my sister justify stealing over $300,000 from our father, I realized that everything I thought I knew about our family was a lie. The devoted daughter who'd sacrificed to care for Dad was actually a calculating thief who'd seen his vulnerability as an opportunity. The sister who'd encouraged my dreams and celebrated my successes had been secretly resenting every moment of the life I'd built. But the worst part wasn't the money, though that was devastating enough. The worst part was knowing that Dad had spent his final months confused and worried about his finances, probably wondering if his mind was failing, possibly questioning whether he could trust his own judgment about what he'd authorized and what he hadn't. Veronica had stolen more than money from our father. She'd stolen his peace of mind, his sense of security, and his trust in his own mental capacity. She'd let him doubt himself rather than admit what she was doing. And now, as she sat across from me justifying every dollar she'd taken, I realized I was completely alone. The sister I'd counted on to help me grieve Dad's loss, to carry on his memory together, to be my family in a world where we only had each other, that sister had never existed. I was mourning not just my father's death, but the death of my entire understanding of who my family was and what we meant to each other. And the person I should have been able to lean on during this devastating realization was the person who'd caused it. The days following my confrontation with Veronica were the darkest of my life. I felt completely untethered, drifting in a reality where nothing I'd believed about my family was true. I'd taken time off from my veterinary practice, something I'd never done except for emergencies, because I couldn't focus on anything. My assistant Maria had been covering my surgeries, but I knew I couldn't stay away much longer without risking the reputation I'd spent years building. I was sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, staring at bank statements and legal documents spread across my coffee table, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Michael Chen, my cousin who worked in the neighboring county. We hadn't spoken since I'd asked him about financial fraud investigation procedures, and I'd been too ashamed to call him back with the details of what I'd discovered. "Hope, I've been thinking about our conversation," Michael said without preamble. "You asked about family financial fraud, and then you went quiet. That usually means someone found what they were afraid they'd find." I started crying before I could answer. For the first time since Dad's death, I had someone on the phone who cared about me without any agenda, someone who might actually be able to help me. "It's worse than I thought," I managed to say between sobs. "Michael, she took everything, over $300,000 across 7 years, and she's not sorry. She thinks she deserved it." "Who's she, Hope?" "Veronica, my sister. She was supposed to be taking care of Dad, and instead she was stealing from him systematically. She had access to his accounts, his computer, everything. And when I confronted her with proof, she acted like I was the problem for not giving Dad enough money while she was robbing him blind." Michael was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him shifting into his professional mode. "Hope, what you're describing is textbook financial elder abuse. It's a felony in this state, and the amounts you're talking about make it a serious one. Have you contacted the police in Maplewood?" "I don't know where to start," I admitted. Veronica made it sound like she was entitled to that money for taking care of Dad. She had explanations for everything, documents that looked official. I'm worried that without Dad here to testify about what he authorized and what he hadn't, it'll be her word against mine. "Hope, listen to me carefully. Financial elder abuse cases are built on patterns of behavior and documentation, not just victim testimony. If she took money without proper authorization, if she used it for personal expenses instead of your father's care, if she concealed the transfers from other family members, that's all evidence that speaks for itself." Michael explained that financial crimes against elderly people were taken very seriously by law enforcement, especially when they involved family members in positions of trust.
He offered to drive over to Maplewood the next day to help me file a proper police report and connect me with resources I didn't know existed. "But Michael," I said, "she's family. If I press charges, there's no going back. This will destroy whatever relationship we have left." "Hope, what relationship? From what you've described, the person you thought was your sister never existed. The real Veronica is someone who spent years stealing from your vulnerable father and then blamed you for not enabling her theft more effectively." His words hit me like a revelation. I'd been agonizing over destroying a relationship that had already been destroyed by Veronica's choices. I wasn't the one breaking up our family. She'd done that when she decided to steal from Dad. The next morning, Michael drove to Maplewood and met me at the police station. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who specialized in financial crimes against seniors, listened to my story with growing concern and anger. Unlike my emotional reaction, her response was purely professional and focused.
Miss Smith, what your sister did is unfortunately common, but that doesn't make it any less criminal, Detective Rodriguez said. Adult children who serve as informal caregivers sometimes develop a sense of entitlement to their parents' assets, especially if they feel their sacrifices aren't adequately compensated. But feeling entitled doesn't create legal authority. She explained that my case was actually stronger than many elder abuse cases because of the documentation Dad had left behind and the clear paper trail of unauthorized transfers. The fact that Veronica had concealed the transfers from me and from Dad's financial advisor showed consciousness of wrongdoing. We see a lot of cases where family members take small amounts over time, hoping it won't be noticed, Detective Rodriguez continued. But $300,000 over 7 years, with clear personal use of the funds? That's not opportunistic theft. That's a planned, systematic criminal enterprise. She also connected me with Margaret Whitfield, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking stolen assets in family financial abuse cases. Margaret had worked on dozens of similar cases and understood both the legal requirements for prosecution and the emotional devastation families experienced when discovering this kind of betrayal. "Hope, I know this feels overwhelming," Margaret said when we met later that week, "but you're not alone in this. Financial abuse of elderly people by family members happens more often than most people realize, and there are legal mechanisms in place to address it and recover stolen assets." Margaret explained that her role would be to create a complete financial analysis showing exactly where Dad's money had gone and how much of it had been used for Veronica's personal benefit rather than Dad's care. This would be crucial evidence for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. "The good news," Margaret said, "is that your sister seems to have made several mistakes that work in our favor. She used her own personal accounts rather than setting up more sophisticated concealment mechanisms. She made large purchases that are easily traceable to personal benefit rather than your father's care. And she admitted to the theft in front of a professional witness." Over the following weeks, as Margaret conducted her analysis and Detective Rodriguez built the criminal case, I started to feel something I hadn't experienced since Dad's death: hope. Not just the hope that justice would be served, but hope that I wasn't powerless against what had happened to my family. I also discovered resources I didn't know existed. The state had a victim assistance program specifically for families affected by elder financial abuse. There were support groups for people who'd been betrayed by family members in similar ways. I wasn't the only person who'd ever discovered that someone they trusted completely had been systematically stealing from a vulnerable relative. Jennifer, my father's financial advisor, became an unexpected ally in ways that went beyond her professional obligations. She'd worked with other families dealing with similar situations, and she helped me understand not just the financial recovery process, but the emotional journey of rebuilding trust after such a fundamental betrayal. "Hope," Jennifer told me during one of our meetings, "your father talked about you constantly. He was so proud of your integrity, your work ethic, your commitment to helping others. He would want you to fight for what's right, even when it's painful."
The most surprising source of support came from Patricia Henley, the bank manager at Dad's primary bank. When Detective Rodriguez contacted her as part of the investigation, Patricia revealed that she'd been documenting her conversations with Dad about his concerns about unauthorized transactions. "Your father was such a gentleman," Patricia told me when I went to thank her for her cooperation with the investigation. "He was clearly confused and worried about what was happening to his money, but he didn't want to make accusations against family. I wish I'd pushed him harder to take more aggressive action, but I respected his desire to handle family matters privately." She also shared something that gave me both comfort and renewed determination. "The last time your father came in, about a month before he passed, he told me that no matter what happened with his accounts, he was proud of the woman you'd become. He said you'd inherited the best parts of both your parents, your mother's compassion and his determination to do what's right, even when it's painful." As the evidence mounted and the investigation progressed, I realized that I wasn't just seeking justice for the money Veronica had stolen. I was fighting to restore Dad's dignity, to honor the values he'd taught me, and to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to other vulnerable elderly people whose family members saw their trust as an opportunity to be exploited. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I had allies who understood what I was fighting for and why it mattered. I wasn't alone anymore. I had professionals, family members, and even strangers who were committed to helping me seek justice and rebuild what Veronica tried to destroy. But more than that, I'd reconnected with the values Dad had instilled in me: the importance of truth, the necessity of standing up for what's right even when it's painful, and the understanding that real family relationships are built on love and respect, not manipulation and exploitation. 3 weeks into the official investigation, Margaret Whitfield called me with news that would change everything I thought I knew about Dad's final months. Her forensic analysis had uncovered something that none of us, not Detective Rodriguez, not Jennifer, not even I, had expected to find.
"Hope, you need to sit down for this," Margaret said when I answered her call. "I've been going through your father's financial records with a fine-tooth comb, and I found something remarkable. Your father wasn't as helpless against Veronica's theft as we initially thought." I was in my clinic's office, reviewing surgical notes between appointments. But Margaret's tone made me close my laptop and give her my full attention. "What do you mean?" "Your father had been building a case against Veronica for months before he died. I found a hidden folder in his home office filing cabinet, tucked behind his tax records where most people wouldn't think to look. Hope, your dad was documenting everything." My hands started shaking. "What kind of documentation?" "Photocopies of bank statements with unauthorized transfers highlighted in yellow, handwritten logs of dates and amounts going back almost 2 years, screenshots of Veronica's social media posts showing expensive purchases that coincided with the largest theft amounts, even photos he took of bank withdrawal slips that showed transactions he never made." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Dad knew? He knew what she was doing? Not only did he know, but he was methodically gathering evidence. There's a handwritten timeline in his careful script tracking when Veronica gained access to his computer, when the unauthorized transfers began, even when he noticed her behavior changing. Hope, your father was building a legal case. Margaret explained that she'd found something even more significant: a sealed envelope marked "For Hope Only," open after my death, that had been hidden in Dad's home safe, a safe I didn't even know he had. The safe had been concealed behind a false back panel in his bedroom closet, and it had taken a professional locksmith to open it after Margaret found the reference to it in Dad's documentation. "Can you meet me at your father's house this afternoon?" Margaret asked. "You need to see this envelope and its contents. And Hope, bring Detective Rodriguez. What's in here changes the entire scope of the investigation." 2 hours later, I stood in Dad's bedroom with Margaret, Detective Rodriguez, and a locksmith who'd already opened the small wall safe.
My heart was pounding as Margaret handed me an envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. For my daughter Hope, the truth about Veronica. Inside was a letter that was 8 pages long, written in Dad's careful script, dated just 6 weeks before his death. As I read it aloud for the group, I had to stop several times to compose myself. My dearest Hope, the letter began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I pray that you've discovered what Veronica has been doing to our family. I've known about the theft for 18 months, and I've been gathering evidence because I knew that someday you'd need proof to protect yourself and to seek justice for what she's stolen. Dad went on to explain that he'd first become suspicious when Veronica started asking detailed questions about his finances, claiming she wanted to help him organize his accounts for tax purposes. When he'd noticed discrepancies in his bank statements, he'd initially thought they were errors. But when the discrepancies became patterns and when Veronica's explanations became increasingly elaborate, he'd started investigating on his own. I discovered that Veronica had been accessing my computer when I wasn't home, using keylogger software to capture my passwords, and transferring money to accounts she'd opened in her name. When I confronted her privately, she broke down and confessed, but she begged me not to tell you. She said she was in financial trouble, that she'd made some bad investments, and that she'd pay everything back. The letter revealed that Dad had given Veronica multiple chances to return the money and come clean with me. Each time, she'd promised to stop and to make restitution, but instead, the thefts had continued and even accelerated. I realized that Veronica was counting on my love for her and my reluctance to destroy our family to protect her from consequences. But Hope, she was also counting on my eventual death to cover her tracks completely. She told me during one of our confrontations that by the time you'd discovered anything, I'd be gone and unable to testify against her. Dad had made the decision to secretly document everything while pretending to remain unaware of the continuing thefts. He'd used a hidden camera to record one of his confrontations with Veronica, capturing her admission of guilt and her promises to stop stealing, promises she never kept. I've included copies of everything in this safe: bank records, photographs, recordings, and a detailed timeline. I've also included evidence that Veronica forged my signature on several documents, including a power of attorney form that would have given her legal access to all my accounts if I had become incapacitated. Detective Rodriguez examined the forged power of attorney document with growing amazement. "This is incredibly sophisticated evidence gathering," she said. "Your father essentially conducted his own criminal investigation, with documentation that would hold up in court." But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Dad had discovered that Veronica's theft hadn't been born out of sudden financial desperation or poor judgment. She'd been planning it from the moment she moved home to care for him after Mom's death.
Margaret showed me printouts of the email exchanges Dad had secretly photographed from Veronica's computer. The correspondence revealed a calculated plan to establish herself as Dad's primary caregiver, gain his trust and access to his finances, and systematically transfer his assets over several years to avoid triggering fraud alerts or family suspicion. Marcus Caldwell, it turned out, wasn't a legitimate financial advisor. He was someone Veronica had met online who specialized in coaching people on how to steal from vulnerable family members. His emails to Veronica included detailed instructions on how to access someone's online banking, how to forge signatures convincingly, and how to create documentation that would support claims of authorization. The beautiful part, one of Caldwell's emails read, is that elderly people often second-guess their own memories. If you take reasonable amounts over time and always have plausible explanations, they'll usually assume they're forgetting things rather than suspecting theft. Dad's final revelation was the most heartbreaking and the most empowering. He'd known that Veronica was manipulating his confusion about the thefts to make him doubt his own mental capacity, and he'd been playing along to continue gathering evidence. "I let Veronica think I was becoming confused and forgetful because it made her careless," Dad wrote.
She started taking larger amounts and being less careful about covering her tracks because she believed I was too mentally compromised to notice patterns or seek help. The letter concluded with Dad's instructions for me. Hope, I've left you enough evidence to not only prosecute Veronica criminally, but to recover most of what she's stolen. More importantly, I want you to know that every dollar she took was a dollar she stole from your future, from the inheritance your mother and I worked our entire lives to leave you. I'm including one final piece of evidence that I hope you'll never need. A recording I made 6 months ago when Veronica thought I was asleep. She was on the phone with Marcus Caldwell, and they were discussing how to handle things after my death. Veronica explicitly states that she's planning to claim I was mentally incompetent and that any evidence of theft was actually authorized by me due to my deteriorating condition. Detective Rodriguez looked at me with something approaching awe. Hope, your father essentially handed us a complete criminal case. Not only do we have evidence of the theft, but we have proof of premeditation, conspiracy, fraud, and planned obstruction of justice. This isn't just theft anymore. This is organized criminal activity. As I sat in Dad's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of both Veronica's calculated cruelty and Dad's quiet strength, I realized that he'd spent his final months not as a confused victim, but as a determined father protecting his surviving daughter from someone who had infiltrated our family with criminal intent. Dad had known he was dying. His health had been declining, and he'd understood that he might not live long enough to confront Veronica directly or see justice served. So he'd done the next best thing. He'd built an airtight case and hidden it where only I would find it, ensuring that the truth would survive him and that I'd have the tools I needed to fight back. My father's final gift to me wasn't money or property. It was justice, dignity, and the knowledge that he'd never stopped being the protector and provider he'd always been, even when I thought he was helpless and confused. With Dad's evidence in hand, what had started as my desperate search for answers transformed into a coordinated legal operation that would ensure Veronica faced consequences for every crime she'd committed. But more than that, it became a mission to honor Dad's memory and protect other families from experiencing what ours had endured. Detective Rodriguez immediately called in additional resources from the state's Financial Crimes Unit. Within 48 hours of discovering Dad's hidden evidence, our small team had expanded to include prosecutors from the District Attorney's Office, investigators from the State Banking Commission, and federal agents who specialized in interstate financial fraud. Marcus Caldwell's coaching emails revealed that Veronica's crimes had crossed state lines, making this a federal case with much more serious potential penalties. Hope, said Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison during our first meeting, your father's documentation is the most comprehensive evidence package I've seen in 20 years of prosecuting financial crimes. But we need to move quickly. If Veronica realizes the scope of what we've discovered, she might try to flee or destroy additional evidence. The investigation team developed a strategy that would allow us to gather additional evidence while preparing for Veronica's arrest. Margaret Whitfield continued her forensic analysis, now armed with Dad's timeline and documentation to trace every stolen dollar. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with banks across 3 states to freeze accounts and preserve records. The federal agents began investigating Marcus Caldwell and his network of people who coached family members on how to steal from elderly relatives. But I also had a personal mission that went beyond the legal proceedings. I wanted to understand how many other people had been victimized by schemes like Veronica's, and I wanted to help prevent other families from experiencing what Dad and I had endured. Jennifer Caldwell, Dad's financial advisor, connected me with the National Adult Protective Services Association, where I learned that financial abuse by family members was one of the fastest-growing crimes in the country. Patricia Henley, the bank manager, introduced me to other families in Maplewood who'd discovered similar thefts by trusted relatives.
Hope, Patricia told me during one of our conversations, your willingness to pursue this case is going to help other families find the courage to seek justice. Most people are too ashamed or too afraid of destroying family relationships to take action against relatives who steal from elderly parents. The most powerful alliance I formed was with other victims of family financial abuse. Through support groups and online networks, I connected with dozens of people whose stories mirrored mine. Siblings who discovered that their caregiving brother or sister had been stealing from parents. Adult children who'd learned that their trusted spouse had been draining their elderly parents' accounts. Families torn apart by the discovery that love and caregiving had been facades hiding systematic theft. Maria Santos, a woman from neighboring Oakville, had discovered that her brother had stolen over $200,000 from their mother while supposedly managing her care during dementia. The hardest part, Maria told me during one of our phone conversations, wasn't the money. It was realizing that my mother spent her final years confused and scared because she knew something was wrong but couldn't figure out what. These conversations taught me that Dad's decision to document everything and fight back, even while pretending to be helpless, was extraordinary. Most elderly victims of family financial abuse never get the chance to gather evidence or protect their other children from discovering the theft after their death. Dr. Alina Rodriguez, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in elder abuse cases, helped me understand the psychological dynamics that had allowed Veronica to justify her crimes. People who steal from vulnerable family members often develop elaborate justification systems, Dr. Rodriguez explained. They convince themselves that they deserve compensation for their sacrifices, that their victims won't miss the money, or that they're entitled to early inheritance. Your sister's anger when confronted suggests she genuinely believed she had the right to your father's money. As the legal case developed, I also focused on practical steps that would honor Dad's memory and help other families. Working with Jennifer, I established the William Smith Financial Protection Fund, a resource that helped elderly people in Maplewood install monitoring systems for their accounts and provided free consultations with financial advisors who were trained to recognize signs of family financial abuse. The fund also supported legal advocacy for other families pursuing justice against relatives who'd committed financial elder abuse. Margaret Whitfield agreed to provide reduced-rate forensic accounting services for families who couldn't afford comprehensive investigations, and Detective Rodriguez helped train other law enforcement officers across the state to recognize and investigate family financial crimes. My cousin Michael, the detective who'd first encouraged me to pursue criminal charges, became instrumental in building connections between our case and similar investigations in other jurisdictions. Hope. Veronica and Marcus Caldwell aren't isolated criminals. They're part of a network of people who specifically target families with elderly parents who have savings and adult children who live far away or are too busy to monitor daily financial activity. The federal investigation revealed that Marcus Caldwell had been coaching dozens of people across multiple states on how to steal from their elderly relatives. His operation included detailed guides on avoiding detection, template letters for creating false authorization documents, and even scripts for explaining suspicious transactions to family members who asked questions. Attorney Morrison explained that our case was becoming a cornerstone prosecution that would help law enforcement agencies across the country understand and combat family financial abuse networks. Your father's evidence isn't just going to put Veronica and Caldwell in prison. It's going to help us shut down an entire criminal enterprise and protect hundreds of other families. But perhaps the most meaningful alliance I formed was with the memory of Dad himself. Reading his careful documentation, seeing the evidence he'd gathered while pretending to be confused and helpless, I realized that he'd spent his final months not as a victim, but as a detective and protector. Every day that he'd allowed Veronica to think she was fooling him, he'd actually been building the case that would eventually bring her to justice. His letter had included one final instruction that I carried with me through every difficult moment of the investigation. Hope. Don't let anyone convince you that protecting family means accepting criminal behavior. Real family members don't steal from each other, and people who steal from vulnerable relatives forfeit the right to be protected by family loyalty. As we prepared for Veronica's arrest and the subsequent legal proceedings, I had assembled not just a legal team, but a community of people committed to justice, prevention, and healing. We had prosecutors who understood the severity of elder financial abuse,
investigators who knew how to trace stolen assets, advocates who supported victims of family betrayal, and other survivors who'd walked this painful path before me. Most importantly, I had the wisdom and protection that Dad had given me from beyond the grave. His evidence would ensure that Veronica faced consequences for her crimes. But his example had taught me that love sometimes requires fighting for justice, even when that fight is against someone you once trusted completely.
The coalition we'd built around seeking justice for Dad wasn't just about one case or one family. It was about changing how society responds to financial abuse of elderly people and ensuring that criminals like Veronica and Marcus Caldwell couldn't continue exploiting the trust and vulnerability of aging parents and their distant children. We were ready for the final confrontation, armed not just with evidence, but with the moral authority that comes from standing up for truth, protecting the vulnerable, and honoring the memory of someone who'd refused to go quietly into victimhood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.